Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We have been looking at Imam Ghazali's distinction between Iman and ideologies, or Iman or Mazhab. And last time we looked at the nature of logical arguments. And today we are going to look at the nature of ideological schools or schools of thought within the discipline of Ilm al-Kalam or within the discipline of Ilm al-Aqaid. So our Imam classifies these interpretation. That is, we first distinguished between knowledge and interpretation. So in the previous sessions, we made a distinction between the text and its interpretation. And based on this distinction, we also made a distinction between knowledge or Iman, depending on the topic, and ideology or al-Mazhab or school of thought. So school of thoughts don't deal with, so you don't, school of thoughts don't emerge or don't dispute on knowledge or Iman, but their disputes are basically related to interpretation of the text. So they don't have that importance which knowledge or Iman has. And the basis for this distinction between text and interpretation, as we said, is that text, whether text of the Quran or Sunnah, the text has only one possible meaning. And obviously, Quran is beyond attribution errors. But in Sunnah, we suppose that only those Sunnah which are beyond attribution error, and if they have only one possible meaning, then there is no question of interpretation in there. And this sort of text is called, in the language of Usulis, a nas. Nas. And whether we are dealing with fiqh, or whether we are dealing with tasawwuf, or whether we are dealing with aqaid, if a text text attribution is beyond any errors or beyond any doubts, and if the text has only one possible meaning, then there's no question of interpretation arises. And if there is no question of interpretation, then there is no school of thought regarding that. There is no mazhab, al-mazhab school of thought regarding that matter. Because school of thoughts in any discipline arise because of the possibility of more than one meaning. But as far as we are dealing with an-nas, what we are dealing with is knowledge. And knowledge doesn't belong to any school of thought. It's not the question of interpretation. And if this knowledge is related to the matter of belief, then this is Iman. Those would be things which will bring you in Islam or take you out of Islam depending on your stance. And there's no dispute regarding that. So there's no dispute of interpretation. So it doesn't belong to mazhab, any mazhab. It belongs to deen, ad-deen, God's deen. Because mazhab belongs to people, deen belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even though mazhab is also belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the sense that it is the interpretation of the text, but interpretation is the people's interpretation. So there's a question of error there. So we have to deal with a question of interpretation leniently. And that's where in Islam freedom of thought comes. And that's most of the discipline, most bulk of the, but that's where we need tolerance as well. And when people ignore this distinction between text and interpretation and knowledge and mazhab, then they make this error of depriving other of freedom of thought, the legitimate freedom of thought, and they are no longer tolerant, and they commit excesses which are against the spirit of Islam. So, for example, obligation of 5 prayers. That's deen, religion. I mean, religion is the wrong translation, but ad-deen, Allah's chosen way of life. That's not mazhab of anyone. You can't say in mazhab Hanafi, or Maliki or Shafi mazhab there are 5 prayers. No, but if you come to Sajda Sahab, for example, that's the question of mazhab, because it's a question of interpretation. So in Sajda Sahab, Malikis have, for example, 2 types of sajdas, Qabli and Ba'di. And Qabli normally relate to naqs, and Ba'di relate to az-ziyada, addition. And if they're 2 are gathered together, then you give priority to naqs and priority to Qabli, for example, in Maliki. So that's the Maliki school of thought in Sajda Sahab. And then they disagree on what type of omissions or additions, obligate Sajda Sahab or not. So this is Mazhab Maliki, because it's the interpretation of texts which in their attributions have different levels and they have more than one possible meanings. So that's why this interpretation. So Mazhab Maliki is the one interpretation of the same text. On the other hand, in Mazhab Shafi, on the same point, they don't have Ba'di, they have only Qabli, Sajda Sahab al-Qabli. Hanbalis, I think Hanbalis there is a detail in Hanbali schools. They just see where Prophet ﷺ did Qabli and where he did Ba'di. And when they both combine, or there's no clear-cut thing, they go for Qabli. And Hanafi school, all sajdas are Ba'di, there's no Qabli. So this is just an example. So these are schools of thought in fiqh, for example. But 5 prayers is not no mazhab of anyone. It's not a school of thought because it's no interpretation, because it is proven through a solid text of Quran and Sunnah, which has only one possible meaning, that there are 5 obligatory prayers. So if you deny there are obligation of 5 prayers, so you just go out of the fold of Islam, unless you have. So these are things which are known as al-malum بالضرورة, so something which is so well known that nobody can not know it. So if somebody denies that, then he must be out of the fold of Islam. But the difference between Qabli, Ba'di, Sajda Sahab, these are interpretive matter. Nobody can, say that, someone is absolutely right, but people should follow what their own conviction is. And by people, I mean people who have knowledge. And those who don't have knowledge in those matters, they should follow those who have knowledge. But as far as 5 prayers are concerned, this is something which is obligatory, knowledge of which is obligatory on all Muslims. So you don't follow any madhab in that. So this is the main distinction between knowledge and interpretation, knowledge and ideology, knowledge and mazhab, iman and mazhab, sharia and fiqh, for example. So let's go back to the. So our Imam classified these interpretation as ideology, then regards the Hanbalis and Asharis and Maturidis, we can add, as different ideological schools. Ideological schools are distinguished by differences in interpretational argumentative structure, not by difference in beliefs. Moreover, these different interpretative structures, that is ideologies, are based on the same epistemological methodology. Okay, so we'd have to unpack this. These are very dense statements, so we'll look at them in a minute. But if we apply the distinction we just made to Hanbali and Ashari and Maturidi school, we can apply that in the same way in which we applied the distinction between 5 times of prayer and Sajda Sahab, which was related to fiqh. On the other hand, Hanbali and Ashari and Maturidi schools, they are a school of thought in a different discipline, which is the discipline of Ilm al-Kalam, or discipline of Ilm al-Aqaid or Ilm al-Tawheed. There are many names of that discipline, that is specialization. So we can apply the same basic distinction and see how that applies to these different schools. So the belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. He doesn't have any partners. This is Iman. And this is Deen, ad-Deen. Nothing to do with mazhab, al-mazhab, or school of thought or interpretation, because Allah is one. It's the basics of Islam. He doesn't have any partner. It is proved by a text which is it is beyond error, and it is a nas. It has only one possible meaning. Qul huwallahu ahad. Ahad has only one meaning, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. So there's no room for interpretation. So there's no school of thought here. And those who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that belief is not regarded as a belief of a Hanbali school or belief of a Maturidi school or belief of a Ashari school. It is deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if you deny this, you are out of the fold of Islam. But then there are matters which either not qat'iyus subut, matter which are not attributable to the text beyond error, or the meaning of text itself. There are more than one meanings possible. More than. Then obviously the question of interpretation arises. And depending on a specific methodology of a specific school, different interpretations result. So for example, like even Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, that's wal-Mi'raj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is proven by the text. But whether this Isra and Miraj was bodily event or was a spiritual event, or even beyond that, for example, whether the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there was a difference of interpretation among even Sahabas. So in those matters where there is more than one meaning possible, depending on the methodology of a school of thought, they have different interpretation. And these interpretations don't bring you in and out of Islam. These interpretations are within the limit of freedom of thought, based on knowledge, obviously. And we should be very tolerant about, even though we should always follow what convinces us in terms of argument. But what convinces us might not convince the other person or the other school, depending on two facts. First, the text itself had the possibility of more than one interpretation. And the second thing is, my methodology is different from other person's methodology. And methodological question cannot always be resolved based on the text itself. So just to give you an example, if you find more than one verses of Quran on the same topic, and they might have slightly different emphasis, or they might even seem to contradict each other, or give different interpretation of the same thing, and you have a lot of different sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the same topic. Now, methodologically, you have more than one, whether this matter is related to your belief or whether this matter is related to your conduct. There are more than one methodological strategies possible to deal with such a. So some people, some schools of thought, they prefer the principle that they try to combine all the hadith and the verses as far as possible. So they go for an interpretation which take into account all those ahadiths and try to combine their meaning. On the other hand, there can be other schools whose methodology is that you should try to see which verses came before and which came after, and which were annulled and which were not annulled, or which ahadith came before and which ahadith came after, and which might be annulled and which might not be annulled. So they might choose the. So if the Prophet ﷺ did different things regarding a certain act. So, for example, we see that he used to drink and eat mostly sitting, but we also see that sometimes he would eat or at least drink standing. So how do you combine them? You can say, okay, we want to combine these two, or somebody would say, no, we go for the action which is, most of the time he used to do. Some other people might say, we go for the action which he did last, for example. So we will just ignore the actions he did before, but what he did in his last phases of his life, what was his last action, that will take priority, because it's possible that, that the actions he did before were annulled. And there are many other strategies that you can do. And what I'm saying is, doesn't necessarily apply to this example. So these different methodological differences, lead to different interpretation. Similarly, in the discipline of Ilm al-Kalam, we have many schools, but the famous ones are Ashaira and Maturidis and Hanbalis. So their differences are not about Iman and Kufr. Their differences are not about the text which has only one meaning. But their differences are mainly about the text which has more than one possible interpretation. And also their differences are because they have different methodologies which they use in understanding those texts. And their differences cannot be regarding the matters which belong to the deen, which belong to the essence of Islam, which brings you in or out of Islam, because those matters are matters based on an-nas, that is the text which doesn't require any interpretation. It has only one meaning. It is an-nas, or it is similar to an-nas, even if it is not an-nas. But all those matters in which more than one textual interpretation is possible because of the nature of the text itself or the methodological differences, then those matters are the matters of detail. Matters of detail. And in matters of detail, you are obliged to believe or act according to your knowledge, but you leave open the question whether other interpretation can be true as well. So that this is the arena of freedom of thought, and it is also arena of tolerance. But human nature is that we try to stick to our group, even if it is within a group within a group. So, and you develop a group thinking and group loyalty, which is fine to an extent, but when it becomes contrary to our loyalty to the truth, it is against the Islamic principle. It becomes a ta'assub. A ta'assub. And a ta'assub is al-maqit. It is killer of faith, because that leads you to excess against the truth, that leads you to excesses against other Muslims and calling them kuffar when they are Muslims like you know what I mean. So because of the group loyalty, people then become mutassib, in their school become ultra loyal to their school of thought, and this leads to excesses against other Muslims and ignoring the basic fundamentals of Islamic spirituality, that is tolerance, humility, and loyalty, fundamental loyalty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not to your schools and all those things. And the worst of it is that then these schools of thoughts are used by oppressive governments all throughout history as an instrument of oppression against Muslims, and especially by imperialism it has been. So the methodological difference between Hanbalis and Asharis, for example, and Mu'tazila were used by Abbasides, and then Asharis were used against Hanbalis, and then Hanbalis were used against Asharis. And nowadays, Hanbalis, they have become part of Saudi sub-imperialism, and Asharis have become part of Hashemite sub-imperialism, Jordan and Egypt and these Emirates, and they have become part of the strategy and instrument of imperialism to crush Muslims and to breed infighting between them about things which are the matters, secondary matters, the matters not fundamental to Islam. And so they make compromises about the text, the an-nas, but they don't want to make compromises about their interpretation. So they have totally changed the whole dynamic. But if we keep everything in the context, then we will see that the basic loyalty is to the truth, and what is beyond error is the an-nas. But the text which is amenable of interpretation, then that's never a basic principle. That's a arena of freedom of thought and tolerance. And our basic loyalty is not to our interpretation, but to truth and to an-nas. And our basic loyalty is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and to mu'mineen, who are all those who believe in this truth, this iman, this knowledge. And our loyalty to madhahib is always secondary. If that's true, but if we forget about all that, then it becomes interpretative matters and disputes become the ruin of iman as well as ruin of our dunya as well, really. as we can see. So this is just the background. I actually didn't want to talk about all these things, but let's see the text and we will continue this next time. So Imam Ghazali radiallahu ta'ala, even though he is the Imam of Asharis, in many of his books, specifically in Fasl al-Tafriqa, but also Al-Iqtisad and other books, he has warned us against these becoming too much attached to ideologies and ignoring the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So our Imam classified these interpretations as ideologies and regards Hanbalis and Asharis as different ideological schools, like different universities. Ideological schools are distinguished by differences in their interpretative argumentative structure, not by difference in Iman and belief and knowledge. So I'll just try to explain a bit of this today, but we'll pick up this because there's a lot that need to be said regarding these two statements. Okay, I'll see you next time.